You Dropbox it to me.
Okay, perfect. So thank you all for joining tonight. So we're going to talk a little bit about the conflict between science and faith. I put that in quotes because I don't think there really is a conflict, but sometimes we do perceive that there is a conflict. So I just gave away the ending here, but we'll dive into it a bit. I'll just give you a little bit of my background. So I grew up as a missionary kid in 3 or 4 different countries around the world. I was very blessed to have strong Christian parents. And during middle school, my science teacher showed me a video explaining why evolution was wrong and unbiblical, and why the only valid view was a literal 7-day creation. I became really fascinated by that. I bought dozens of books on it. I watched tons of videos on it. I really dove into that, and I learned from a lot of the experts in the field. And I started getting engaged in online forums. I think it was like Ask Jeeves or something, I don't know, something like that. But and I started debating people, and man, the first few months I was doing great. I was winning all these debates, and I was like, wow, this is cool. Until one day, a biology professor hopped on and point by point started pointing out where certain fallacies or holes were in my arguments. And what's really interesting, and I won't go into creation and evolution too much this week, we can do that next week if you all wish, but I think the key point I want you all to get is that was a challenge to my faith. And it really forced me to make my faith my own. The reason it was a challenge is because I had tied creationism so closely with my faith that when someone said, hey, there's an issue with creationism, perhaps, that made me think, oh, maybe there's issues with my faith, right? So I had tied those two together. It wasn't until college where I majored in microbiology. I realized that the more you learn about something, often the less conflict you actually have once you really dive into it. So, I went back and forth with different views on the creation of the universe, and at some point I held most of them, and I can tell you now, I think most of them are incomplete. So unless you can explain to me nuclear fission and everything under the sun about how atomic energy works, and so we'll get into that, but there's reasons I think maybe our human brains aren't large enough to handle something as large as perhaps the creation of the universe and how that exactly worked. So, but the first point I want to get across is, again, the more you dive into both science and scripture, the less you find room for conflict. And to put it more succinctly, I believe science is the study of God's creation. I think we can back that up biblically. So at a foundational level, I believe if you hold that God created the universe, which I think we all do, then we can learn about God through learning about his creation. And if we can turn to Romans 1, if someone is able to read Romans 1, 18 to 23, that would be great. Oh, you'll need your Bibles tonight, by the way. We'll be looking at a few verses. All right, do I have any volunteers for Romans 1, 18 to 23?
I can do it if you want me to, Ken.
Yeah, great.
Okay. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. What can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. Although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal men and birds and animals and creeping things.
Perfect. Thank you, Pat.
Mhm.
So let's dive into this, unpack it a little bit, right? So it's clear, going back to verse 20, that his power and divine nature are clearly seen, right? And how do we clearly see it? Being understood from what has been made through his creation, right? And it says it's so clear that you can see God through his creation that people are without excuse, right? So this is key, right? Through creation, we can understand God's power and also understand God's nature. I mean, I think that's a basic facet of what we want to do as Christians, right? Understand God's nature better, right? Understand God's power better. And it says plain as day here that we can see that through his creation, right? The danger comes is, and that's the rest of the verses, is when you look at creation and you worship the creation instead of the creator. And that's where things go wrong. But I think there is a foundational theology that says you can understand God through his creation. And so if science is trying to understand the world around us, is that not just studying God's creation, right? And understanding God better. And so we can study science to better understand God's power and nature. And that's actually been science throughout most of history, believe it or not. So if I name some names for you, Louis Pasteur, Pascal, Kepler, Newton, Galileo, Francis Bacon, this is just a very short list of really foundational scientists who all held theology as more important than science, really. It was their love of God who drove them to observe things in nature and write things down and come up with theories about how things worked. The more of the tension didn't arise till very recently in history. Throughout most of scientific history, it was very much a study of God's creation to better understand God. And even today we see Francis Collins. He's the director of the NIH, or the Health and Human Services. I forget. I think it was promoted to that. And so the preeminent scientist in America today. And he holds that DNA is the language of God, and he has a great book written about that called "The Language of God" by Francis Collins. So that's a great read. So even today we see this. So I think the people who hold there being some sort of conflict are really in an outlier in terms of history. So that's the first point I want to get across. The second point is that many conflicts arise because of poor theology or a poor understanding of science. So I'll say it again, many conflicts arise because of a poor understanding of theology or a poor understanding of science. So when we look probably at the most famous example of this is Galileo. So he took some observations of the way the planets seem to move, the stars seem to move, how the earth seems to move in relation to that. And he says, hey, it seems like maybe the earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. So the prevailing theory of that time was that everything revolved around the earth, because in our human nature, I think we tend to in our sinful nature, think everything revolves around us, right? But he said, hey, it certainly seems like things revolve around the sun. If I can read to you just a few excerpts of the Catholic Church's reaction to that. The Dominican Father Caccini said, geometry is of the devil, and that mathematicians should be banished as the authors of all heresies. So that's a pretty strong reaction there. They said that Galileo's pretended discovery vitiates the whole Christian plan of salvation. and it casts suspicion on the doctrine of the incarnation. So right, probably today we look back at that and say, why, like, how do you how do you think the incarnation is under threat because we revolve around the sun, right? So so let's go to a verse here, one of the key verses, Psalm 96. And Psalm 96, is someone able to read verse 10?
Verse 10,
Yep.
I can do.
Great.
Sorry, I'm just pulling it up. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. The world also is firmly established. It shall not be moved. He shall judge the peoples righteously. Let the heavens rejoice and let the earth be glad. Let the sea roar and all its fullness. Let the field be joyful and all that is in it. Then all the trees of the woods will rejoice before the Lord. For he is coming to judge the earth. He shall judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with his truth.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So going back to verse 10, it says the world is firmly established and it cannot be
I'm
moved.
sorry.
Oh, no. That's perfect.
I apologize.
That's great. I want to read the end as well, so that's perfect.
I didn't see the verse.
No, verse 10, it says the world's firmly established. So if I say, well, that means the earth doesn't move, so the sun must move around us. What would you all say in response to that?
If you say that the earth is firmly established and so the sun does not, no, so the earth does not move and the sun moves around us.
Yeah, that was the argument.
So I have to put myself now or myself back then?
Well, how would you respond to me if I was trying to argue that the
Okay.
earth was, is still and does not move?
I would say firmly established does not mean that it is unable to orbit, that it's unable to move. It means more about that it is a sphere, right? Like it is I'll say it this way, it is a sphere, it's a planet that is not going to change, but not saying that it's stationary.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other takers on this?
I can also add it's firmly established as part of God's creation. But Ronnie's point's well taken. I can offer that now, but maybe if I were alive back then, I might be swept up in the same kind of view that a lot of those people had back then.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate that. And this was one of the 2 or 3 verses that the church centered their argument around, and saying that Galileo's observations were violating the sanctity of the scriptures. Like you said, Pastor, maybe back then I might have got caught up in that too. I don't know. From my perspective here, I can say, if I look a verse down from there and I say that the trees of the forest will sing for joy, I haven't noticed trees vocally singing with joy. And so perhaps these could be metaphors, right, for something greater. And so the danger here, I think, is that if you apply bad theology here, saying this is something about how the earth functions in the solar system, you actually miss the point of the verse, right? You miss that God's justice, his righteousness, his faithfulness is as firmly established as the earth. You miss the point of that. And it's a beautiful passage about how we worship God, praise God, about his strength and his glory, how firmly established his faithfulness is, and how we can ground ourselves in that, and that we can sing for joy through that, and that his justice will come. So no matter what happens to you, no matter what happens to me, we can always be grounded in that. It says firmly established as the soil under our feet, right? That's a beautiful picture. And I take a lot of solace in that. If I misinterpret that as, oh, this is a picture of how the earth orbits, I totally miss that picture, right? So it not only creates a conflict, you miss out on understanding what that verse is all about.
What I would say is my feet are on solid ground.
Yeah.
On solid ground.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that there's order too. There's order.
Yes.
It's firmly in order.
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
you know, honestly, in reading it, like you said, you know, if you don't look at the beautiful metaphors and poetry in it, and if you read, obviously, you know, the entirety, but even if you go back to 9 and read into 10, then you understand what 10 is saying and referring to. And then that it shall not be moved. It can also be referring to the Lord's reign will not be moved, because the Lord reigns. The world also is firmly established. It shall not be moved. It may not be referring to earth. It might be referring to the Lord anyway, but there's many ways to, you know, take that, and they could have misunderstood that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Because the Lord is sovereign. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and really, it's a beautiful verse, isn't it? It's a beautiful chapter. And we miss that if we apply bad theology to it, right? And it creates these unnecessary conflicts. And so, you know, it really is, most cases, poor theology or a poor understanding of science, where I find these conflicts arising. And the shame is in a verse like this, where you miss the real meaning of it. You know, even just now, I get like chills thinking about, you know, God's faithfulness and how firmly established it is. What a beautiful picture that is. I mean, in COVID times right now, where everything can seem topsy-turvy, to be able to be grounded as something as solid as the earth under our feet, you know, that's beautiful. So yeah, that's that. Now let's flip it around. A lot of times we have a poor understanding of science. First of all, I think some people have this image of scientists being like all atheistic people out to get Christians. There was surveys done recently, and the majority of scientists say that profess to be Christians. So, you know, we'll take care of that one. Most evolutionists don't actually have a view on the origin of the universe, even within that specific field of evolution. Very few of them actually study anything about the origin of the universe. That's an entirely different field. One more example, the Big Bang Theory. That was a religious idea. They said, in the beginning, God said, let there be light. And someone said, what would that look like based on what we know about physics when light enters somewhere there has been no light, and light interacts and creates matter and energy, and there must have been a tremendous explosion. And someone said, oh, is that at the Big Bang? And that name kind of stuck. And so that was a religious idea. If it was actually also alluded to in John 1. Right? In the beginning was the word logos, the word for word is logos, right? And logos was probably one of the richest words I can think of. It means so much, but in Greek philosophy, you know, it's a Greek word, so it obviously is borrowing the meaning behind that. So logos, one way to describe it is there's an order. So I remember we were just talking about order, right? But there was an order in the universe, and they said at the beginning there must have been like a curtain of atoms just flowing in perfect unison. And one day something happened and knocked one of the atoms out of place. This was in Greek times, so way before someone knew what an atom was. And they said these atoms must have collided and must have been chaos, and matter must have formed around these atoms and created living things that are made out of atoms. I realized this was 2,000 years before anyone discovered an atom, right? So that's kind of what that word pulls from. So, and then let's see. And of course, these ideas were perpetuated and then confirmed by science when they said, hey, it looks like at some point everything was a single entity and became everything, which confirmed these, religious ideas about, oh, it must have started with light. It must have started at a single point source. And then at some point, strangely, the church then totally rejected those ideas and said, oh, that doesn't make sense. And that's not, so it was a very interesting thing that happened. But, once you look into some of the histories behind these things, it actually becomes fairly interesting to see how those have interacted throughout history. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail about some of those things next week. But again, I just want to stress poor theology or a poor understanding of science is where a lot of this starts. And then the last point I want to make is that science and faith look at different questions, so they really can't be in direct conflict. They look at different things. So science looks at how things happen, but it can't answer why. Or maybe more importantly, what for, right? Those are the questions that faith looks at. And historically, when we have science removed from philosophical discourse, really bad things tend to happen. And, the pastor can probably think of 10, 20 things off the top of his head about when that's happened before. And that's the danger in Romans 1 as well, right? We can learn about God through science, but we can't make science our God. So really the why questions and what for questions are the critical questions in life that are actually more important than why things are happening. That's what faith answers. And I feel like when faith tries to answers the other questions, instead of really pushing those forward, we do a disservice to society as a whole. In addition to those individuals who could really use, who could come to Christ through this. So that's that. And the thought I want to close with is, let me see if I can pull this up. So St. Augustine in the 4th century, this is kind of a long quote, so I'll try to read it slowly. He's talking about Genesis, and he says, what kind of days these were, it is extremely difficult or perhaps impossible for us to conceive, right? I can admit fully that after, I'm not the smartest person in the world, but in looking at the different creation theories, I can say all of it's probably more complicated than I'll ever understand, right? We can understand how atoms form to create elements, but what must have happened at the beginning of the universe probably is way, way, way over my head, right? Then he says, with these facts in mind, I have worked out and presented the statements of the book of Genesis in a variety of ways according to my ability, and in interpreting words that have been written obscurely for the purpose of stimulating our thought, I have not rashly taken my stand on one side against a rival interpretation, which might possibly be better. I'm going to read that last sentence again. I have not brashly taken my stand on one side against a rival interpretation, which might possibly be better. If you understand what he's saying there, he's saying what happened is probably hard for us to actually conceive, probably impossible for us to conceive. And so why should I take my stand, brashly take my stand on any of these, right? When I believe we can't truly understand it. And his rationale for that is that his purpose is to bring people to Christ, right? And so if I take a stand on this and I'm immovable and someone else has a different view, it could be a hindrance to bringing them to Christ. Now there's a fine line between saying, we should do whatever the world says, but this is coming with humility and saying this person's salvation is more important than proving that I'm right on this view, because I have enough humility to admit that I probably don't know all the details on this. Does that make sense? So, and this is kind of what I did wrong. I think when I was in middle school, I had tied this so closely to my faith that became dangerous to my faith, right? This is the warning in Romans as well, that we worship things of creation rather than the creator. And so that's my largest frustration, is that sometimes Christians unnecessarily create conflicts that don't need to exist, right? That hinder people from coming to Christ. There are many, many scientists who perceive Christians as holding out of date or illogical or irrational views. And they're accosted by these views and they say, well, if that's what they think, how am I going to trust them with something as important as my view on life and the purpose of life, right? That should come paramount, I believe. And so the last thing I want to do is to alienate people, seekers, from coming to Christ because of poor understanding or incomplete understanding on my part. So, really that's kind of what I want to focus on. Can we bring people to Christ? And next week, I think what I want to focus on, and I'm open to any of your thoughts, but there's a lot of powerful ways to bring people to Christ through seeing the harmony between faith and science. So I think those are the things we should focus on, and not necessarily these areas where we create conflict either through a lack of understanding or theology, or some place where we have an incomplete understanding and need to have faith, right? So, so with that, I'll take some questions or thoughts from you all.
I'm just going to speak, and I apologize. I do have to go. Well done. And I love this. This is something that I talked about with my daughters all the time, from the time that they probably could just understand my language and understand, and just the power of the unification of the two. And I think if you keep your mind open and you are able to see the intersections, and I really love how you said science is the study of God's creation. And I think that's just beautifully said. And just when you read the Bible and you think about some things in science, and literally then you could be able to see the power that's being expressed there in our limited vocabulary, of what it takes to let there be light, like out of darkness. And if you think about and really read Genesis over and think about the science that goes into it, it's incredible, the power that's being exhibited there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's beautiful. Thank you.
Daniel, what was the line about DNA, the language? You said it in the beginning.
Oh, the language of God?
The language of God. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I guess it's also just the order of the creation of the world, but then down to the littlest molecule, I can't even get my head around it, but that's what I've just got to know, that it's, it just didn't collide or, so thank you for the what fors. It's faith is for what for what purpose. So thank you.
I just want to say I enjoyed this very much, Daniel. And it just takes me back to Genesis as well. And Jane just said that word again, the order in which we are in, the order of which he created us and created this. To me, that's always been just a mind blower. When I see how trees and things are in order, in his order, I'm always in awe of him. I got to see a granddaughter born. And in that moment, just seeing that creation and knowing that was God's hand. So I'm just always in awe of him.
Yeah,
And I'll be
beautiful.
glad when I see him, I'm going to say, can we sit down and have a talk? I just want to know. Yes.
Yeah, that's great.
Daniel, I want to just thank you for this great job. And also, just to echo a point you said, the media tends to focus on those scientists who are antagonistic toward Christianity, but they are actually, as you and I have discussed, like Richard Dawkins and so forth, but they're actually in the minority in the scientific community, but they get a lot more of the airtime, so to speak, than what the reality is.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also with the conflicts. Thank you for sharing, it's, we don't have to discuss the conflicts, or try and battle on the good news is what we share. Not the, we don't, good news is simple. The, creation versus evolution is, with all the views, it's, golly, we could all get twisted into pretzels, but just sharing the good news or being the example of the good news too, and then I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. It says taste and see that the Lord is good, and that's what we want people to do, right?
Rather than it be an argument,
Right.
what is this person arguing with me about his faith, so he says it's, so.
All right. Any closing thoughts from anyone else?
So next week we can look forward to part 2, right? So and and we again thank you for this, Daniel.
Yeah, if you'll have me back, I'm happy to go into part 2, and you can ping me with any questions during the week, and I'll try to address them next week as well. Yeah.
All right, awesome. I'll go ahead and close this in prayer if that's all right. So, Father, thank you so much for bringing us together tonight. I thank you for how awesome and wonderful you are, and I thank you that you have given us the ability to study your creation. I pray, Father, that it will, as Daniel has said tonight, as we look at your creation, that it will strengthen our faith in you and strengthen our gratitude and our worship in you. And we ask this in your Son's holy and precious name. Amen.